Very good. Thank you very much for everybody attending. My name is Brandon Fowler. I'm Public Information Officer for the Klamath County Sheriff's Office. This afternoon we have several speakers to update you on a case that is well over 4 decades old. First to speak, following me, will be Sheriff Caber. Detective Dan Towery from Klamath County Sheriff's Office will provide a summary of the case and the findings. District Attorney Eve Costello will offer a few words as well. Sheriff Caber will provide some closing remarks, and then we'll take some questions. So with that, I'll hand this over to Sheriff Caber.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I've been asked to kind of open this up. I do appreciate, by the way, that you came, and then there are some news agencies here that traveled quite a ways. I think these things are important for families of victims. Once cases are solved, that we go ahead and acknowledge that and all the work that went into solving a case such as this. You know, we all have different roles on these sorts of investigations, these major crimes. There's many ways that law enforcement agencies find out about homicides, which is what we're talking about today. Sometimes they find out as they're happening. Sometimes they find out years later. Sometimes they find out from citizens' complaints, and sometimes it starts with a missing persons case. In this particular incident, it started out with some people out in the woods, and they located something that no one wants to ever come across. But once law enforcement is involved, it starts a long chain of events. In this case, lasted more than 40 years to get to this point today. And we sometimes forget that. We watch TV and things are solved in an hour. But in this particular case, it took decades. So I think at the time that this happened, in 1978, I was around then, but I was a much younger man myself. And a lot of the technology things that we have today simply weren't there, and they weren't there for a long time. Also, what we didn't have a lot of was the resources that we have today, with major crime teams being developed and things like that, where all this collaboration takes place. I'm sure Sheriff Burkhart, who's in the room, can tell you that it was a little bit different back then. And so it usually came down to 2 or 3 guys doing a lot of work. And so hopefully in my closing remarks, I can discuss that a little bit more. These also what we had crime labs, I'm sure, back in the 70s, but technology has caught up with that piece of it as well. And I think some of that will be on display today. And what I'll point out later on is the fact that our actions even today, we don't really know how that's going to play out 20, 30, 40 years from now, what technology might be available then. So that creates a situation where we have to do the best job possible starting today even. So with that, I will turn it over to the detectives that actually work the case to give you a summary of everything that happened as best he can in a short period of time. And as you heard, there'll be questions later. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Caber. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this afternoon. Appreciate you attending this. Like Sheriff Caber mentioned, this case is right at 43 years old. Took place in early November or mid-November 1978. Before I get started and give you the brief on the case, I do want to introduce you to the individuals up here at the table. We'll start with former Klamath County Sheriff Carl Burkhart, Detective retired Nick Kennedy, Detective retired Geneva Lewis, myself, currently assigned to the Klamath County Sheriff's Office Detective Division. My name is Dan Towery. I've been back here with the Klamath County Sheriff's Office for approximately just over 5 years now. Born and raised, started my law enforcement career Montana, lateraled back because I wanted to be home, work these type of cases, work with the people I do. I basically came in with some very large shoes to try to fill or even attempt to catch up to. Sheriff Burkhart at the time, 78, was assigned the lead detective with Detective Pitts or several other members from the Klamath County Sheriff's Office, Klamath Falls Police Department, Oregon State Police, numerous agencies from Oregon, California. This investigation spanned decades, and Sheriff Burkhart was lead detective and then eventually moved up as sheriff, but this was always his case. That was one of the first things I learned when I came to Klamath County and then back into the detective division with Detective Kennedy was 78 case, dead Indian. That was Sheriff Burkhart's baby. That's the one that we need to work on and do what we can. That said, let me give you a quick overview of the case. On November 17th, 1978, approximately 17:30 hours, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office deputies responded to a remote area near Lake of the Woods and Dead Indian Highway on a report of human remains being discovered. The reporting party was in that area cutting firewood when he came upon what he presumed to be skeletal remains. Klamath County deputies responded to the area along with Detective Burkhart, and at that time, one individual was discovered, later to be identified as Kirk Leonard Wiseman of Southern California, date of birth 6/19 of 59. There was a small dog, remains found kind of at that same time along with him. The following day, well, the scene was secured the following day. Crime lab deputies responded back up to the area to start the investigation, conduct a more thorough search. And at that time, an additional human remains were located of a female, later identified as Cynthia Lynn Fryer, date of birth 10/22/1960. They were 17 and 19 years old. Through that time, the autopsy, the investigation discovered that they were shot, both of them, multiple times in the head by a small caliber firearm. There was also indication through the investigation that Cynthia had been sexually assaulted. That case, like I said, Sheriff Burkhart at the time, detective, and then Sheriff Burkhart at the time worked it clear up until early January 2001 when he retired. I want to stress that there was multiple leads, multiple people they were looking at, multiple agencies, up and including the FBI, that was helping, giving information at that point. From that time on, the case kind of sat there. Few people looked at it until right about 2011 when Detective Kennedy at that time took over as lead of the investigation. It was our oldest case at that time unsolved. At that point, Detective Kennedy started to go back through the evidence, the DNA, things that the lab can do, how they can extract blood, saliva, hair, all those things. We started looking that way because the advances in that area had increased exponentially. 2015 comes along, Detective Lewis came into the detective division. She took over the case and again started going back over all the evidence that we had, which originally goes back to Detective Burkhart and the great job those guys did in securing that and preserving it for us and later generations to try to solve. Through 2011, 2015, clear up until the end of 2018, multiple items were submitted to our crime lab that we work with, which is the Bend Crime Lab for Oregon State Police. At that time, a few items of clothing belonging to Cynthia were submitted. Shortly after that, January 2019, Detective Kennedy retired. I took over the case. Spring of 2019, I got a call from the Bend Crime Lab. And I want to pause right there just real quick and tell you what a special person forensic scientist Devin Mast is. He worked the case on their end up at the Bend Crime Lab. He did all the analysis. He went over the evidence. Amazing what he did. I get a call from Devin. Devin says, hey, we got something. He says, I want to send it to Portland. Want to make sure, confirm it. Great. Send it up to Portland. Wait a little while, probably early summer, I get the call from Portland. We've identified an unknown male, number one, which is how we classify it, because we don't have a name. At that point, the DNA that they had recovered, who we titled unknown male number one, was entered into the national database, the CODA system, which is the convicted offender DNA index system nationwide. We didn't get no hits. Throughout that time, while working with Detective Kennedy and also on my own time, I had seen this program and heard of this company called Parabon. They're a private lab back east. They work with law enforcement. One of the well-known ones that they're famous for is the Golden State Killer. They helped with that case, from my understanding. Based on that, I contacted them, asked them their interest in the case, and talked to my admin, and we got the green light. I also, at this time, want to mention the great work that Marshall University did. Parabon directed us to Marshall to develop that sample, which we then sent to Parabon. Through that, their chief genealogist, C.C. Moore, took over the case from the Parabon perspective and did what they do. And I won't even get into how they do that. That's their expertise. But basically, it's through all the genealogy research. They work it backwards, and then they come down the middle from common grandparents down to a viable suspect, which is what Parabon gave us. Early summer 2021, Parabon released a report to us, giving us a viable suspect and a name. At that point, I took that information and, with the permission of my superiors, started working that end of it. I was able to contact the viable suspect's family. They helped with me traveling out, meeting with them, sitting down, talking with them. We had found out that the viable suspect was deceased. He had died in Texas in 1996. So we didn't have him to go get something from, but we had to show that our unknown male, the DNA we found on Cynthia's clothing, was what Parabon was telling us, it's this person. The family was gracious enough to provide buccal swabs, DNA for comparison, and based on that, I traveled out there early August, returned back to Klamath County, submitted those swabs. We collected DNA from ex-wife and 2 living children of our suspect. Based on that, we were able to complete the triangle and say that unknown male number one was in fact Ray Whitson Jr., our suspect. Crime lab confirmed. I sent those samples to the crime lab. They did their testing. They're diligent in all of that. They sent back the report. I gave the report to District Attorney Eve Costello to confirm what we had. And at that point, based on our suspect, Mr. Whitson, being deceased, we have suspended the case at this time based on his DNA being on the female victim's body. One thing I do want to point out was that there was no other contributors. We had the 3, we had both victims, and we had the one suspect, or viable suspect, Mr. Whitson, at the crime scene on the deceased female. So at this point, we don't feel that there's anything further. We feel that we have sufficient evidence to say that had Mr. Whitson been alive at this point, we would do a continuing investigation, but we would have PC to arrest him at this time. Based on that, he is now deceased. Ms. Costello, I'll let her talk about that part of it. So, thank you.
It's don't touch the mic. Okay, I won't touch the mic. Eve Costello, Klamath County District Attorney, and I just want to give huge kudos to the law enforcement previously, initial law enforcement, and I tell everyone that Detective Towery's totem animal is a hound dog, and it's great. We are talking about creating a cold case unit and really pushing forward on these cases. And we really want to do that and do that quickly because, as you can see, this suspect passed away in 1996. If we had been, just 10, 15 years earlier, we would have been able to hold that individual accountable in a way that now we cannot do. What we have been able to do, though, is bring closure for a family. Sorry. Because when somebody dies and you don't know really what happened, you just know that they left this universe in a really awful way, it leaves you with a huge hollow feeling. And this work has allowed that family to have some degree of peace. Not that there really ever is peace when you lose family members in such a horrific manner, especially kids that are so young and not from this area. So I give huge kudos to law enforcement for all the dedication that they did in this. I think you really brought a lot of peace for the family, and I think that's where the kudos lay. Having reviewed the case inside out and backwards, that's before we went and did the extra push using a private DNA lab that is expensive, so it did take a little bit out of budget, and we're oftentimes strapped. We went ahead and had he been alive, we would have definitely arrested. I believe from reviewing the file that we have enough to charge, and for a prosecutor to charge, you have to believe you have evidence sufficient to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. So most of the work is all law enforcement, and I say they get huge kudos for that. So thank you guys very much.
Well, thank you, everybody, for adding to that. That's great. I just like to say that in closing, or before we maybe answer some questions, that I think the investigators from 1978 all the way up to 2021 and now 22 did a wonderful job. Very proud of them. I know they're all dedicated to their work. But I'm going to zero in for just a second on the work that was done in 1978 by Sheriff Burkhart and his fellow detective at the time, Roger Pitts. Those men probably remember, I know they do, they remember about that day very well, because I talked to Sheriff Burkhart just before this meeting started, and he remembers details about it as if he just did it yesterday. And that's just the way it is. Once you start those things, it becomes part of who you are, it becomes part of your history, it becomes part of your memories that you don't forget. And so I just want to thank him specifically for doing a great job. He did a great job collecting evidence that he didn't know years later would be lead to something like this, where some sort of DNA analysis could be done and a suspect finally developed and identified. I think that is just a tip of the hat to good police work. Preserving evidence is one of the things that is so important, and so we have to remember that even today, that the work that we do today, preserving evidence, getting statements, doing our investigative work, writing our reports, could help someone solve a crime in the future that we weren't able to finish today. So that's one point I would like to end with. Beyond that, once again, I appreciate everybody coming. I appreciate everybody that's worked on this and the investment that they made. And I do wish that the families have complete closure on the fact that they know now what happened with their family members. And a tragic thing, no doubt. Thank you. I guess we're now open for questions, and I don't know who would have those, or who needs to answer them.
I was wondering if I get some clarification on the suspect's name, the whole name.
Ray Mason Whitson, Whitson, Jr.
You know what we have, and I think we can distribute, hopefully Detective Towery brought some with him, was some copies of the flyer that was prepared in 1978. Sheriff Burkhardt said he had to take it to a print shop. The kinds of things that we can put together now with a few clicks of the thing, he had to go take it to a print shop and create a flyer. We have that flyer, and we were able to distribute that to you as well. You have enough for everybody?
I just made them one copy. We can make some copies before we leave for everybody to distribute.
Well, you know, they have these fancy things like cell phones. They're probably going to take a picture of it and they can pass it on.
I wanted to see how much it costs to go through the Parabon and get that DNA last.
That's a good question. In fact, I remember when Detective Towery started sending me emails about having to spend money on a 1978 homicide investigation. And, you know, I let that email slide to the bottom for a couple of days because it's a lot of money and it was a long time ago. He was persistent. He is a hound dog. He kept coming back and forth. And we finally, we looked at the probabilities of making some headway. The probabilities were slim, but they were there. So I think totally, in 3 different times we had to put out some money through our sheriff's office budget to cover this. I think it was close to $8,000 total, but you know, when you're running budgets, every 1,000 here and 1,000 there, you really want to make sure you use it wisely. This gives me a lot more confidence the next time this might come up that is money well spent.
Sure. Is there no connection between the suspect and the victims?
I was told by Sheriff Burkhardt, and he can surely, if he would like to, come on up and talk about that. It was his case. I owe it to him to let him speak about that.
Hi, Sheriff Burkhardt from 1989 to 2000. We had no connection at all from victims in the Klamath Falls area as far as we were able to determine at that time. The only connection to Klamath Falls was in that dog carrier you see in the flyer. There was some personal belongings in there, and there was a hitchhiking sign that said K Falls, I think. That's it. No connection here as far as we could ever tell. And the suspect in this case was able to stay quiet all those years. I couldn't believe it. He didn't tell someone at some point in time, but we could never determine whether he did or not. I'll be glad to answer anything else I know about the scene, if you want to talk about the scene.
Question about, at that time frame. Was he a suspect at the time? Was he?
No, his name never came up at all over the year, all these years until lately. DNA. I tell you, back in those days, we had police notebooks, flashlights, and pens. That's what we had.
You still did a fabulous job.
Well, the hitchhike driver was identified at the time, wasn't it?
We had a possible suspect back in the days that claimed what happened initially to start this case. When the news first press release came out, we had an individual call the Oregon State Police in one of the coastal towns. I can't think of which city it was now, but he says, "Hey, I gave those kids a ride." So instantly we started looking at him, of course, and got a 5-page criminal rap sheet out of California. But he claimed he dropped him off in Grants Pass and at a McDonald's. And we never could connect him with the scene, but he did pick him up. We confirmed that. He picked him up in Roseburg after they spent the night in a motel there. They were hitchhiking on I-5, and he picked him up and claimed he dropped him off in Grants Pass, which apparently he did. So.
He could have been cleared if DNA had been available.
No, we had no DNA. We were lucky to have a blood typing on a homicide scene. Blood type down to about 3 or 4 levels in those days.
Is that suspect still alive? You know?
No, Mr. Albano was deceased. He passed away back in the 90s, late 90s.
If he were here, I'd go buy him dinner. Because he swore up and down he wasn't involved, but there was so much evidence that he was involved at the time, we just didn't believe him at the time.
So some follow-up to the one question, as far as connection to Klamath County. I did speak with relatives of both the victims. I spoke with the aunt of Cindy yesterday on the phone. One of the main reasons for that was we were going through the evidence that is from the time Sheriff Burkhart collected it. We still have an evidence, and it's in our long-term storage over at the courthouse. Anyway, by doing that, we were going through identifying some of the stuff that the family may want. In relation to that, we actually do have Cindy's earrings she was wearing at the time, and that will be released to the family. That said, I was talking with her aunt out of Texas, and about a year or two prior to this incident, they had taken a trip up here to Klamath Falls. Cindy was with them. They were going to Crater Lake. At that time when they got up here, the weather was such that they couldn't get up there, but Cindy said at that time she wanted to see Crater Lake. Also in the original case with Philip, when he picked him up in Roseburg on September 23rd or September 24th, they rented the hotel the 23rd, they left the 24th. They had a map and had Klamath marked on it. They were actually discussing with him the best routes to get from where they were to the Klamath area. She had told him at that time that she had friends here. That said, we don't know if they actually ever made it to Klamath Falls. With our viable suspect, Mr. Whitson, talking with his family, he moved here in about 76 with his family. His kids attended schools here in the Klamath area. They left about 82, but within that time, he worked at one of the local lumber mills. And sitting there talking with his family, I talked about the area where this occurred. They said, yeah, we know that area very well. We used to go up there all the time. We would go camping. We had friends in the Ashland area. We were always taking that route. So whether Cindy and Kurt, when they were dropped off in Grants Pass, then ended up going on down to the Ashland area where Mr. Whitson then came upon them and offered them a ride, or however that occurred, we don't know. Or they actually made it to Klamath Falls, and at some point he contacted them over here and then took them back that way. That's always going to be an unknown. That's one of the questions I wish I could have sat down with Mr. Whitson and asked him to get those final clarifications. But at this point, we just will never know. But yes, she did have something to come to Klamath Falls for. Yes, sir. That's one of the very curious things is when I started looking at him, he did not. There was nothing that we could find on him. I actually, saying that, I wanted to give, and I forgot in my original statement to give a thank you to the, and I ain't going to pronounce this right, but it's Houston, Texas, the county there in Houston, Texas, their cold case investigation unit. They actually did quite a bit to help me track down Mr. Whitson and his death, how he died. We confirmed that he was dead through the coroner there for the city of Houston. It was quite an exhausting process to try to locate anything on him. Usually you can go to the state vital records and they'll have something, but it was quite a unique situation the way he died. It was non-criminal, it was all medical, but based on that, it kind of made a challenge to actually confirm that he was deceased. And then again, speaking with the family, they provided me with a certified death certificate, which backed up and confirmed what Houston had told me about his passing. So his family said he worked in a lumber mill here locally at that time. On his death certificate, it lists that he was a road construction worker, which is very pertinent to some of the original thoughts that Sheriff Burkhart had about who might have been responsible for this. I guess I'll just real briefly talk real quick on that point. A lot of times, like the sheriff said, there's a lot that goes into investigating one of these major crimes. You're looking at all, unless you've got somebody that says he did it, then when we don't know, I mean, you look at all the different angles. I will tell you that when we finally got the information on Ray Whitson, that the more we got into it and the more we started looking, the boxes started checking off. which was something that on all the other people that we looked at, you could never, I mean, there was maybe some possibility that they were involved, but we could never start checking those boxes. With Ray, the boxes, even up to what the family had told us about him. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you had already mentioned this, but did you look into any records that he owned a .22 caliber gun?
So that said, when I was visiting with the family, they talked about him owning a small caliber handgun that he always carried with him. Like I said, those boxes started checking in all those areas. And I'll just say once again, if Mr. Whitson was alive today, yes, we would probably arrest him on PC, or we would be arresting him, and that investigation would continue into those very things.
And they didn't have to register firearms back there. I look at all of these news media people and save one, you're all very young. So didn't have to register firearms. Probably lots of folks had them back then. And in the 1970s, guys, we were a wild town. And if you want to look at that, I think there was lots of work for law enforcement to do all the time, right?
Lots of things.
Lots of things, yes. They were very busy, so.
I can help a little bit on your technology point of view here. I'm not a certified anything with the crime lab or anything like this, but a couple of shots on Google, you guys are going to do this anyway, but I'll point you in the right direction. The first case that was a criminal case that used DNA was actually in England in 1983. So this was already a cold case before the first DNA was ever used in a crime. And there's been a lot of benchmarks on DNA's use over the years for different types of crimes and using different types of materials and different generations of tests and all that. And it finally got to the point where the samples we had would make a viable profile to where an individual could be identified with it. And I think a great deal more experience with the sheriff and Sheriff Burkhart too. It is not uncommon to have a homicide suspect didn't do anything else, just got stupid one day. That happens. And then it's, if they can keep quiet, it does make it tough. So at any rate, that's the best I can tell you. If there's any more questions.
For Gaber, what did the family respond when you were asking for their DNA or their help?
It was as you suspected. So there was a divorce after they left Klamath Falls in the early 80s. They went back to California, and then from there the family split. It was tough for them, but I will say this, and I'm glad you asked that because it brings up another point too. It was tough for them, but they understood the need for the victim's family to have closure, and the oldest daughter that I spoke with and met with, so I met with his ex-wife and his two daughters. And then there's two more sons that are in separate places in the country. But they were torn. But like I said, the oldest daughter, she understood the need of it. And so did his ex-wife at that point. So the samples that I got were from his ex-wife, his oldest daughter, and then one son out of Illinois supplied a sample for us to test. And bringing up the point that reminded me of that, speaking with Cynthia's aunt yesterday, and also with Kurt's family when I went up and visited with them early December, they really wanted me to express their gratitude to the family of Mr. Whitson for making that possible, that now they could have closure. Along with that, I'll just mention real quick too, is the evidence that we've identified that I believe should go back to the family. There were some letters that were written. There was a postcard from the motel that they stayed in Roseburg that they had started to write. Never got mailed. And it's there, and now we're going to get to send that to the family. There's a letter from Cynthia to her mom and dad a few days prior. Never mailed. Talked about what they were doing in Washington, talked about their hopes and dreams, and never got mailed. I'm going to get to return that to her mom and to her aunt. So those are the things that what the suspect family made possible. Without them, and that's it, without them, this wouldn't be possible right now. We would still have that sample in CODIS, hoping to get a hit, and we would be trying to work any avenue we could as law enforcement to obtain something to compare to unknown male number one, which is our viable suspect, Mr. Whitson. So.
And I've noticed since you started talking, you've been very emotional. What does this mean to you?
I would love to say it's just another case, but it's not. My wife can attest to that. All the time that that I traveled, being away from home, my fellow detective that I share an office with, sitting listening to me on the phone, all the things, bouncing ideas. That's one thing too. She always said, "You're going to solve this," and I'm like, "Well, I just am lucky enough to be the last one in the chair to take it across the goal line. Everything from the beginning." All the way, we'll use a football analogy, to bring it all the way across the 50-yard line, clear up to the 80, to the 10, to the 3-yard line, sitting right here. These are the guys. I was the lucky one to be handed the ball and got to raise my hand in the goal line. But it's these guys that did it. And it, like the sheriff said, it started with the detectives in '78 and how they were diligent in collecting the evidence, bagging it in a proper way. That way it's there. If we hadn't solved it, it would still be there for, like Sheriff said, future detectives to take a look at. And we've got, close to a dozen more cases, a couple of them that we right now are actively working. Same thing. It's all on how, when we go to the crime scene, and that's one of the first things as being part of the major crime team. When we get to the crime scene, we got to do everything we can to preserve that evidence and make sure it's done properly.
You say you're working something out, and then will DNA and more expensive emails and shit?
Yeah, without a spoiler alert, yes.
Open cases.
Open cases, yes.
My question perhaps for Sheriff Ricardo.
Okay.
Sorry, detective. And it kind of goes along the same line with Amber's question, which is, did you see the victims at the time?
Did I see the victims? Yes, I was there.
So, does this do anything to end that memory for you?
Homicide scenes are never pleasant. You always try to know your victims while they were alive is much better. So. But it's a good case. I'd like to tell you, there's a gentleman's picture right back there was at the crime scene, Ed Kentner. He worked for the Forest Service. He turned out later to be a commissioner here, too, also. He's a gentleman with a crew cut, kind of in the middle. And just a little comment from all the people who are involved in this case. When I started, I was a fairly new detective, and Sheriff Duryea let me stay on this, Sheriff Tom Duryea, stay on it for lots of hours. Chief Dan Toffel from the Klamath Falls Police Department, he was the chief deputy for the sheriff's office at that time. So he was out at the scene also. Another one you could interview, he was out there. Forest Service investigator Robert Harper was at the crime scene, helped me a great deal. He was a Forest Service investigator. Detective Dean Schoenberg, who's deceased now. Salem Crime Lab. And then Mike Hurley from Medford was a crime lab technician also involved in this case. Trooper Barmore from the Oregon State Police fingerprint detail, he did the fingerprinting on all the dog carrier. Detective Ron Rose from the Klamath Falls City Police was also involved. He's deceased now also. Medical examiner Dr. Nicholson, who's also deceased now too, was involved in all our casework on this too. And then, of course, you've heard all the other folks, but there's lots of people involved in this. Lots of people led to this effort here. And I congratulate the guys now that carried this on through.
Okay, with that, any last questions? Is Sheriff Burkhart going to write a book?
If I was a better writer,
Oh.
write an old crime, my police reports were totally boring, believe me. No flash at all.
Okay, well, once again, thank you, everybody. I know we had moved this a couple of times trying to work around the weather and people's schedules and things of that nature. So I want to thank everybody for making it out here and appreciate everybody's flexibility. With that, have a nice afternoon and be safe going home. Thank you.